Hi, this is Andrew from Unitarian Apologetics. Welcome to the slow tier Trinitarian argument series where I lose brain cells talking to people on TikTok so you don't have to. Today's slow tier Trinitarian argument concerns the instance of Jesus touching a leper in order to heal him. The general idea from the Trinitarian here is that somehow the law of Moses teaches that it's a sin to touch a leper. And since Jesus was born under the law, but also sinless, he must be God who is above the law in order for touching the leper to not be sin. All right, so here's the general argument from the Trinitarians. They say, 1, Jesus was born under the law. 2, touching a leper is sin according to the law. 3, Jesus touched a leper. And 4, therefore Jesus must be God who is above the law in order for touching the leper to not be a sin. So what's the big underlying assertion in this argument, besides the unusually absurd proposition that God is above the law, therefore could not sin? The big underlying assumption here is that touching a leper is sin according to the law. And to assume and assert that touching a leper is a sin according to the law of Moses shows a fundamental lack of understanding concerning ritual purity laws and purity sacrifices in the law of Moses. The first thing we want to establish is there's not a single explicit text in Scripture which says that touching a leper is a sin. And this is the key assumption on which their whole argument is based, on which, if it's proven to be false, the whole argument collapses. So we're not going to grant them that touching a leper is an act of sin. It just doesn't exist. What Scripture does say is that if someone comes in contact with someone who is unclean, having a condition such as leprosy or even blood or bodily discharges of any sorts, it does render someone temporarily in a state of ritual impurity. But the only way for a sin to occur when someone is in a state of ritual impurity is for them to enter into the sacred sphere of the temple or touch a sacred object before going through the proper steps in order to become ritually pure again. Okay, and so before looking at what the Scriptures actually teach concerning ritual purity, let's first look at the inconsistent triad presented by the Trinitarians. An inconsistent triad is essentially a set of 3 propositions which cannot all be true at the same time. The first proposition in the triad is that Jesus is under the law. Scripture clearly teaches that Jesus was born under the law and therefore subject to the law. The second proposition is that Jesus is sinless. And the third proposition is that touching a leper is a sin. Okay, so we agree that Jesus touched a leper. But if we say that touching a leper is a sin and Jesus touched a leper, then you have to reject proposition 2, which says that Jesus is sinless. If you say that Jesus is God and therefore above the law, then you reject premise 1, that Jesus was under the law. Or else you violate the law of non-contradiction, which says that Jesus was both under the law and not under the law. And so in order for the other 2 propositions to be true, one of them has to be false. And since we agree that Jesus was born under the law, and since we agree that Jesus was sinless, the proposition that has to be false is that touching a leper is a sin. And one of the verses that this person brought up with this argument is in Leviticus chapter 5. In verses 3 and 5, we read, "If someone touches human impurity, any kind of impurity which makes him unclean," so this would include touching a leper, "and it is hidden from him, when he later becomes aware of it, he is in a state of liability. And when he finds himself liable in any of these cases, he shall acknowledge the fault he has incurred." Okay, but let's notice the key word here in this text that occurs in verses 1 through 5. And it is this phrase, "if it is hidden from him." The general sentiment behind this phrase is if someone forgot that they touched something unclean, or if they touched it by accident, didn't realize that they had done it, but then later become aware that they were unclean, later they would be found in a state of liability. But first of all, Jesus was completely aware that he touched a leper. So none of this can apply to him. And there's nothing in the text which indicates that this was hidden from Jesus or that he forgot he was in a state of ritual impurity. So the instance here in Leviticus 5 would not apply to Jesus. But we read, if this were to happen, we see in the next verse, Leviticus 5:6, that if this happens, if he wasn't aware that he touched something unclean and was in a ritually impure state and went on about his business, or if he realized he touched something but forgot he did and went about his business in a ritually impure state, then he would be required to give an offering for that which he has incurred. It says a female from the flock, a sheep or a goat, as a katat offering. And the priest shall perform the rite of purgation on his behalf, restoring him from his condition. Okay, and the key phrase that we want to focus on here is the katat, which is commonly and misleadingly interpreted and translated as sin offering, as we'll see in just a moment. So in the context of ritual impurity, katat is better interpreted as and translated as purification offering, since no sin has occurred. Okay, and we're going to look at several prominent Levitical scholars which all agree that this is the case. The first excerpt we see is from the purification offering in priestly literature by Inkiachi. He writes that Jacob Milgram has established himself as the leading modern authority on the interpretation of the katat. He writes that katat should be translated purification offering for the following reasons. The term is a derivative of the pael verb, which means to cleanse, expurgate, and decontaminate. Moreover, the katat is prescribed for persons and objects who cannot possibly have sinned. Okay, he does say that it is sometimes prescribed for persons who have sinned, but in these instances concerning ritual purity, it's used in instances for a person who could not have possibly have sinned. And in his conclusion, Kiachi agrees and says that katat should be translated, as Barr and Milgram suggests, as purification offering or purgation offering, rather than the conventional sin offering. This is because the former translation conveys more comprehensively to the modern mind the basic function of the katat than the latter. We also read from the Word Biblical Commentary, Volume 4, concerning Leviticus 2 through 3, concerning things which someone might be unaware of or forget and come to mind later. They write, the third case concerns the touching of any human uncleanness. This would particularly refer to contact with bodily fluids or objects contaminated by any kind of human uncleanness. In both cases, the person becomes unclean, but the incident is forgotten. When that one comes to remember it, guilt is incurred. In these two cases, it is difficult to pinpoint the aspect of the act that requires a purification offering. For becoming unclean is an ordinary occurrence that carries no guilt. The only dangers are either entering a sacred area while unclean or in not taking the steps to become ritually clean. Milgram claims that the prolonged period of uncleanness, because of one's forgetfulness or negligence, is what needs to be expiated. So we'll see that this passage does not apply to what happened in the case for Jesus, because Jesus was fully aware that he became ritually impure. There's nothing in the text which says he forgot and then entered into the temple or touched a sacred object, for instance. All Jesus would have needed to do is to go through the proper steps to become ritually clean again. And again, as they state in the Word Biblical Commentary, becoming unclean is an ordinary occurrence that carries no guilt. And we'll see a perfect example of that in just a second from Scripture. And again, there's nothing in the Mosaic Law Code which ever explicitly legislates touching a leper. And so the argument about touching a leper has to be cumulative and analogical based on how impurity works everywhere else in the system. And we have two perfectly good examples from scripture themselves, which illustrate the same idea concerning ritual impurity and when it could constitute sin and when it does not, and what needs to be done in order for someone to become pure again. The first case that we see is in Numbers 19:11 through 13, in the instance where someone might touch a dead body. We read, "Whoever touches any dead body will be unclean for 7 days. He must purify himself with the water on the third day, and on the seventh day, then he will be clean." And so we see here this man has become ritually impure due to touching a dead body, and all he needs to do is follow the proper protocol in order to become clean again. He has to purify himself with water on the third day, and he has to purify himself with water on the seventh day, then he will be clean. But it goes on and says, "But if he does not purify himself on the third and seventh days, he will not be clean. Anyone who touches a human corpse and fails to purify himself defiles the tabernacle of Yahweh. That person must be cut off from Israel. He remains unclean because the water of purification has not been sprinkled upon him, and his uncleanness is still on him." Okay, so it's only one who sins who fails to purify himself and then in turn defiles the tabernacle of Yahweh. And so Jesus simply becoming ritually impure does not mean he has sinned. All he would have had to do was go through the proper protocol in order to become ritually pure again. One of the better examples we have, which really illustrates this point, is the example concerning childbirth in Leviticus 12:1 through 6. We read, "Then Yahweh said to Moses, say to the Israelites, a woman who has become pregnant and gives birth to a son will be unclean for 7 days. As she is during the days of her menstruation, the woman shall continue in purification from her bleeding for 33 days. And let's pay attention here. She must not touch anything sacred or go into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are complete." And so again here, this woman becomes unclean simply by becoming pregnant and giving birth. So by the Trinitarian's logic, becoming ritually unclean is a sin. Therefore, a woman getting pregnant and giving birth to a child means that she's a sinner. And we know that that's just an evil proposition. It goes on to say, "When the days of her purification are complete, whether for a son or for a daughter, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a katat." And again here, what's at question is how do we interpret or understand this word katat? The Levitical scholars understand that no sin has occurred here. So the idea that this woman is going to offer a sin offering simply because she became pregnant and gave birth does not communicate the intention of the katat, since no sin has occurred. And so our conclusion is the idea that Jesus would have sinned simply by touching a leper shows a fundamental lack of understanding concerning ritual purity in the Mosaic Law Code. According to Mosaic law, Jesus would have only been ritually impure until the allotted time has passed, and only could have sinned if he entered the temple or touched sacred objects while in a state of ritual impurity. And we read nothing like that in Scripture. Becoming in a state of ritual impurity is a common and often unavoidable state. For example, a woman becoming pregnant and giving birth puts her in a state of ritual impurity, and she is required to give a katat offering even though no sin has occurred. Their view also exposes the lack of understanding concerning the katat and purification offering, which is often erroneously or misleadingly interpreted as sin offering. I hope that this video has blessed you. Stay tuned for more effective responses to slow tier Trinitarian arguments.